Marriage has a way of settling into routines. Some are comforting, like the familiar smell of coffee in the morning or the quiet rhythm of a shared evening. Others are less so, like the widening spaces that form between conversations or the nagging feeling that something is missing but you can't quite put your finger on it. My name is Jaxon, and I've been married to Emily for 11 years. I work as a systems analyst, a job that mostly involves numbers, logic, and a fair amount of staring at screens. Emily, on the other hand, is in pharmaceutical sales, a career that demands charisma, long hours, and a lot of client-facing events. We've always joked about how different our worlds are, but for a long time, it worked. Our marriage wasn't perfect, whose is, but we had built a life together that felt solid. A modest home in the suburbs, a dog named Tucker, and a circle of friends who often envied how well we seemed to balance our busy lives. Over the past year, though, things had started to shift. Emily's job had always required her to be out late on occasion, attending networking events or entertaining clients. But lately, those late nights had become more frequent. It seemed like every other evening, she had a dinner, a meeting, or some impromptu business event to attend. At first, I didn't question it. Her career had always been demanding, and I admired her dedication. But as the weeks turned into months, I couldn't help but notice some changes. She started putting more effort into her appearance before these outings, choosing outfits that were a little dressier, spending extra time on her hair and makeup. Big meeting? I'd ask, watching her carefully apply lipstick in the mirror. Just dinner with a client, she'd reply casually, barely glancing in my direction. The answers always seemed reasonable, and yet, they left a nagging unease I couldn't shake. It wasn't just the effort she was putting into her looks. Her phone, once left casually on the counter or sofa, was now always in her hand or tucked away in her purse. When it buzzed, she'd glance at it quickly, her expression unreadable. I tried not to overthink it. Emily was social by nature, and her job required her to maintain relationships with clients and colleagues. But the distance between us was becoming harder to ignore. Our conversations had grown shorter, more surface level, as though we were two colleagues sharing a space rather than partners in a life we'd built together. I chalked it up to stress. We'd both been busy, and I told myself that this was just a phase, something we'd work through once things calmed down at work. What I didn't know then was that the phase wasn't going to end. And a single observation from a mutual friend would soon send my world spinning in a direction I never saw coming. It wasn't just work dinners. It wasn't just late nights. It was something else entirely. Emily's late nights became such a regular occurrence that I started to normalize them. Another work dinner, she'd say, breezing out the door in her tailored blazer and heels. I'd nod, distracted by my own work or halfway through cooking dinner, and let it slide. But as her schedule grew busier, I couldn't help but notice the little things that didn't quite add up. It started with her explanations. They were always vague, like placeholders for a story she didn't feel like telling. It's just networking, or a client needs some hand-holding. When I asked which client or where the dinner was, her answers were non-committal. "Oh, you don't know them," she'd say. "It's one of the newer accounts." Then there was her phone. Emily had always been glued to it, part of the job, she'd say, but now it felt different. She was careful with it, always keeping it close, flipping it over when notifications popped up. She started taking calls in another room, shutting the door behind her and returning with a breezy, "just work stuff." It wasn't just the phone. Her outfits for these dinners grew increasingly sophisticated. She'd always dressed well, but lately, it felt like she was trying a little too hard. Dresses that hugged her figure, heels that clicked confidently against the floor, perfume that lingered in the air long after she'd left. Big night? I asked one evening, watching as she adjusted her necklace in the mirror. She smiled, her tone light. "Just trying to make a good impression. You know how it is." I didn't know how it was. My job didn't require late-night dinners or perfectly coordinated outfits. It required spreadsheets and coffee and long hours at my desk. But I nodded anyway, feeling that familiar unease creeping in again. The tipping point came one Saturday afternoon. I was out running errands when I bumped into Nate, a mutual friend of ours, at the hardware store. We chatted for a bit, catching up on life, work, and how Tucker was still chewing through our furniture, before he casually mentioned something that made my stomach drop. "Hey, by the way," Nate said, shifting the bag of screws in his hand. "I saw Emily the other night at that new French place downtown." I didn't want to interrupt, but she seemed busy. Looked like she was having a good time. I frowned. "The French place? You mean Bon Amos?" "Yeah, that's the one," he said. "I was there with some coworkers. She was sitting near the back, with a guy. I figured it was a client or something." I forced a smile, nodding as though nothing was wrong. But inside, my mind was racing. Emily had told me she was at a networking event that night, not a fancy French restaurant. And she certainly hadn't mentioned meeting a client one-on-one. "Probably work-related," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Yeah, probably," Nate said, not picking up on the tension. "Anyway, tell her I said hi." The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about what Nate had said. Bon Amos wasn't the kind of place Emily usually went for work dinners. It was intimate, romantic, the kind of place we used to go on anniversaries. When she came home that evening, I tried to act normal. But as I watched her kick off her heels and pour a glass of wine, I couldn't help but wonder, who was she with that night? And why hadn't she told me the truth? The uneasy feeling that had been simmering for weeks finally bubbled over. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that Emily's late nights weren't what she claimed. I didn't have proof, not yet. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. After my conversation with Nate, I couldn't stop replaying his words in my head. Bon Amos. A guy. Looked like she was having a good time. The image of Emily laughing across the table from someone else, in a setting so unlike her usual work dinners, lodged itself in my mind. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I started going over everything. The late nights, the vague explanations, the sudden attention to her appearance, it all felt too coincidental. But coincidences don't stack up like that without reason. The next day, I decided to pay closer attention. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew I couldn't keep ignoring the signs. The first thing I did was check her social media. Emily had always been active online, posting snapshots of her day or sharing updates about her work events. But as I scrolled through her profiles, I noticed something strange: she hadn't posted anything about her recent outings. That was unusual for her. Normally, she'd post a group photo or tag herself at a restaurant, always with a caption about another successful client dinner. But the last few weeks? Silence. I checked her calendar next, the one she kept on the kitchen counter to track her work schedule. It was full of vague entries like, client meeting, downtown, or networking event. No specifics, no names. Just placeholders that didn't tell me anything. I wanted to believe it was all innocent, that I was overthinking things. But the more I looked, the harder it was to ignore the inconsistencies. One evening, as she got ready for yet another dinner, I decided to ask her directly. "You're going out again?" I said, trying to keep my tone casual. She nodded, slipping on a pair of earrings. "Just a quick meeting. Nothing exciting." "Where to?" I pressed. "Just the usual spot," she said, avoiding my gaze. "Who's the client?" She hesitated, just for a moment, before replying, "Oh, you don't know him. It's one of the newer accounts I'm handling." Her answer sounded rehearsed, like she'd been expecting the question. I nodded, pretending to accept it, but inside, my suspicions grew. Later that night, after she left, I found myself pacing the living room. My thoughts were a storm, churning with doubt and frustration. I couldn't confront her without evidence, but I also couldn't keep living in this limbo, questioning everything she said and did. That's when I remembered Nate's comment about Bon Amos. If she'd lied about where she was that night, what else was she lying about? The next morning, I called the restaurant, pretending to be confirming a reservation. "Hi, I'm trying to double-check a visit from earlier this week," I said, my voice steady despite the nerves. The name would be Emily, last name. The hostess was polite but firm. "I'm sorry, sir, but we don't share details about our guests' visits." I hung up, frustrated but undeterred. If I couldn't get answers from the restaurant, I'd have to find them elsewhere. Over the next few days, I started keeping a closer eye on her. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I also couldn't let this go. If she was hiding something, I needed to know. I wasn't ready for the truth, not really. But I was starting to realize that it was already there, waiting for me to find it. The more I watched Emily, the more apparent it became that something wasn't right. Her late nights didn't just continue, they started to feel orchestrated, like she was carefully managing what I saw and heard. It wasn't just the vague explanations anymore, it was the way she avoided eye contact when I asked questions or how her answers felt just a little too polished. I started tracking her movements, not because I wanted to be suspicious, but because I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling in my gut. I wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew I had to do something. The next time she went out, I decided to follow her. I waited until she left the house, dressed in one of her sharp black dresses, her heels clicking on the pavement as she walked to her car. She waved casually, her smile practiced, and said, "Don't wait up." I gave her a 5-minute head start before grabbing my keys and heading out. I kept a safe distance, my heart pounding as I tailed her through the city. She parked outside a restaurant, not Bon Amos this time, but another upscale place I recognized. It wasn't the kind of venue you'd pick for a casual business dinner. It was intimate, with low lighting and quiet corners designed for privacy. I parked across the street and watched as she walked inside. A man was already waiting for her, standing by the entrance. He smiled as she approached, leaning in for a hug that lingered just a little too long. My stomach dropped. They went inside, disappearing from view, and I sat there in my car, frozen. My mind raced with possibilities, trying to explain what I'd just seen. Maybe it was a client, I told myself. Maybe this was all some misunderstanding. But deep down, I knew better. Later that night, after she returned home, I casually checked the kitchen counter where she always tossed her purse. Sure enough, there was a receipt tucked inside, a dinner for two at the restaurant I'd followed her to. It was signed with her name, alongside a note that read, "Thanks for everything. See you soon." The handwriting wasn't hers. I stared at the receipt for what felt like an eternity, my chest tight and my hands shaking. This wasn't just suspicion anymore, this was proof. Emily came into the room moments later, her makeup still flawless despite the late hour. She saw me holding the receipt and froze, her expression shifting from surprise to something closer to fear. "What's that?" she asked, her voice unnaturally calm. I looked at her, my emotions a swirl of anger, hurt, and disbelief. "You tell me," I said, holding it up. She hesitated, her lips parting as though to explain. But instead of answering, she simply turned and walked away, leaving me standing there in silence. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. The betrayal was no longer just a possibility, it was real. And as I stared at the dark ceiling, I realized there was no going back from this. The life I thought we had was gone, replaced by a truth I didn't want to face. The next morning, I couldn't keep it in anymore. Emily's avoidance the night before had been the final straw, and I needed answers. I waited until she came downstairs, her expression wary as she saw me sitting at the dining table, the receipt from the restaurant laid out in front of me. "We need to talk," I said, my voice firm but steady. She sighed, her shoulders slumping as she took a seat across from me. "Jaxon, I don't have the energy for a fight this morning." "This isn't about a fight," I replied. "It's about the truth. Who was the guy you had dinner with last night?" Her eyes flicked to the receipt, and for a moment, I saw panic flash across her face. But she quickly masked it, leaning back in her chair. "It was just a client," she said, her tone dismissive. "You know how my job is." "Don't do that," I said sharply. "Don't brush this off like it's nothing. I followed you last night, Emily. I saw you meet him." Her face went pale, and she opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. "Who is he?" I pressed, my voice rising. "And don't you dare tell me he's just a client. Clients don't leave notes like this." I held up the receipt, my hand trembling. Emily's shoulders sagged, and she looked down at her hands. "His name is Alex," she admitted quietly. "Alex," I repeated, the name tasting bitter on my tongue. "And what exactly is Alex to you?" She hesitated, and I could see the wheels turning in her head, trying to decide whether to lie or come clean. Finally, she said, "He's someone I've been spending time with." "Spending time with?" I echoed, my voice dripping with disbelief. "That's how you're going to describe it?" She winced, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't mean for this to happen, Jaxon. It just did." I stared at her, my chest tight with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "How long?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "A few months," she said, her voice trembling. "A few months," I repeated, the words hitting me like a punch to the gut. "So every time you said you were working late, every time you left for a networking event, you were with him?" "Not every time," she said quickly. "Most of it was work, I swear. But sometimes," her voice trailed off, and she looked away, unable to finish the sentence. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. "Why, Emily? Why would you do this to me? To us?" "I don't know," she said, her voice breaking. I was feeling lost, Jaxon. Like we drifted apart. And Alex, he made me feel seen again. Like I mattered." Her words stung, but they didn't justify what she'd done. "So instead of talking to me, instead of trying to fix what was wrong, you decided to throw away 11 years of marriage for some guy who makes you feel seen?" She didn't respond, her tears falling freely now. "I can't believe this," I said, pacing the room. "Do you even realize what you've done? How much you've hurt me?" "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't want to hurt you, Jaxon. I was stupid. I made a mistake." "A mistake?" I said, laughing bitterly. "This wasn't a mistake, Emily. This was a choice you made over and over again." She tried to reach for me, but I stepped back, shaking my head. "I need space," I said. "I can't even look at you right now." I left the room, my heart pounding, my mind racing. The life I thought we had was gone, shattered by the weight of her betrayal. And I had no idea if it could ever be put back together. After the confrontation, the house felt like a hollow shell of what it once was. Emily and I drifted through the days like ghosts, avoiding each other as much as possible. When we did speak, it was brief and emotionless, like strangers forced to share the same space. I threw myself into work, staying late at the office and volunteering for extra projects. Anything to avoid coming home. But no matter how much I tried to distract myself, the betrayal lingered in the back of my mind, gnawing at me like a wound that refused to heal. Emily, for her part, seemed to be trying. She stopped going out late, and her phone spent more time on the counter than in her hand. She left notes apologizing, cooked my favorite meals, and even suggested we go to therapy together. "I want to fix this," she said one evening, her voice trembling. "I know I broke your trust, Jaxon, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." I didn't answer her. I couldn't. Every time I looked at her, all I could see was Alex, the man she had chosen to spend her evenings with while I sat at home, believing her lies. Sleep became almost impossible. I'd lie awake for hours, replaying the past few months in my head, trying to piece together the moments where everything had gone wrong. When had she started pulling away? Had I missed the signs? Could I have done something differently? One night, unable to bear the silence any longer, I grabbed my phone and started scrolling through old photos. There we were on our honeymoon, laughing as the waves crashed around us. At a friend's wedding, holding hands as we danced. At home, cuddled up on the couch with Tucker sprawled across our laps. I couldn't reconcile the woman in those photos with the one who had lied to me so easily, who had chosen someone else over the life we'd built together. The next morning, I woke up feeling like I hadn't slept at all. I stared at the ceiling, the weight of the decision I'd been avoiding pressing down on me. Could I forgive her? Could I ever trust her again? Part of me wanted to try. 11 years of marriage didn't just disappear overnight, and there was a time when Emily had been my best friend, my partner, the person I trusted more than anyone else. But the other part of me, the part still raw from the betrayal, knew that things would never be the same. By the time I got out of bed, Emily was already up, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. She looked up as I walked in, her expression hopeful but cautious. "Morning," she said softly. I nodded, grabbing a mug and pouring myself some coffee. The silence between us was heavy, filled with all the things we weren't saying. "I've been thinking," I said finally, setting my mug down. "About what you said. About fixing this." Her eyes lit up, and for a moment, I saw the Emily I used to know, the one who believed we could conquer anything together. "But I don't know if I can," I continued, my voice breaking. "I don't know if I can move past this, Emily. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Her face crumpled, and she reached across the table, her hand trembling. "Please, Jaxon," she whispered. "Give me a chance. Just one chance to prove to you that I can be better." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that we could go back to the way things were. But as I looked into her tear-filled eyes, all I could feel was the weight of the betrayal between us, an invisible wall that no amount of apologies could tear down. "I don't know," I said finally, standing up and walking away. As I closed the door to the guest room behind me, I realized that no matter what decision I made, nothing would ever be the same again. Emily's efforts to repair our marriage became more pronounced in the following weeks. She suggested counseling, wrote me heartfelt letters apologizing for her actions, and even deactivated her social media accounts, claiming she wanted to focus entirely on us. "I know I've hurt you, Jaxon," she said one evening, her voice trembling. "But I'm not giving up on us. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." I agreed to counseling, partly because I wanted to believe there was something left to salvage, and partly because I felt too exhausted to argue anymore. Maybe a third party could help us navigate the mess we'd created, or at least help me decide if this marriage was worth saving. Our first session was tense. Emily seemed eager to talk, her words spilling out in a mix of guilt and desperation. "I betrayed Jaxon's trust, and I hate myself for it," she said, tears streaming down her face. "But I love him, and I want to rebuild what we had." I sat in silence, my arms crossed, unsure how to respond. The counselor, a calm and empathetic woman named Dr. McKinney, turned to me. "Jaxon, how do you feel about what Emily just said?" I hesitated, then finally spoke. "I feel conflicted. Part of me wants to believe her, to think we can move past this. But another part of me wonders if I'm just setting myself up to be hurt again. Emily reached for my hand, but I pulled away, the memory of her betrayal still too fresh. Over the next few sessions, we dug into the roots of our problems. Emily admitted that she had felt disconnected and unappreciated, while I confessed that I had been so focused on work and routines that I hadn't noticed the growing distance between us. It wasn't easy, but I started to see glimpses of the woman I had fallen in love with, the one who had once been my partner in everything. Slowly, cautiously, I began to let my guard down. One evening, after a particularly emotional session, we went out for dinner together for the first time in months. It was awkward at first, the conversation stilted and polite. But as the evening went on, I found myself laughing at one of her stories, the tension between us momentarily easing. For the first time, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe we could get through this. Maybe the pieces of our marriage could be put back together. But the fragile progress we had made came crashing down a week later. It was a text. I didn't mean to see it, but her phone buzzed while she was in the shower, and the notification lit up the screen. "Alex, can we talk? I miss you." My stomach dropped. All the progress, all the trust one had been trying to rebuild, it shattered in an instant. When Emily came out of the bathroom, I was waiting for her, holding her phone. Her expression shifted immediately from calm to panic. "What's this?" I asked, holding the phone up. Her face paled, and she stammered, "It's nothing, Jaxon. I haven't responded to him. But he feels comfortable enough to message you," I said coldly. "So what else is going on, Emily? Have you been seeing him again?" "No," she insisted, tears welling in her eyes. "I haven't seen him, I swear. He won't leave me alone." I didn't believe her. "Not anymore." "Get out," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "Jaxon, please," she begged, reaching for me. "Get out." She packed a bag and left that night, sobbing as she walked out the door. As I sat alone in the empty house, the hope I'd felt just days ago was gone, replaced by a crushing sense of finality. Emily had made her choice, and now, so had I. The house was quieter than ever after Emily left. The echoes of her sobs as she walked out the door haunted me for days. At first, I thought I might feel relief, like a weight had been lifted. But instead, all I felt was emptiness. For a while, I tried to convince myself that this was the right decision, that there was no coming back from what she'd done. She'd lied to me once and proven that she couldn't be trusted to change. And yet, a small part of me still clung to the idea that maybe, somehow, we could have made it work. Then the rumors started. It began with an innocent comment from a coworker. "Hey, I ran into Emily the other day," she said. She looked, well, let's just say she didn't seem too upset about the split. "What do you mean?" I asked, my stomach tightening. "She was with someone," the coworker said hesitantly. "They looked close." I tried to brush it off, but the seed of doubt had been planted. Over the next few days, I started hearing more, snippets from mutual friends, vague references to Emily moving on quickly. I couldn't resist the urge to check her social media, even though I knew it would only hurt me. Her profile was still deactivated, but Alex's wasn't. It didn't take long to find a photo of him at a bar, his arm around a woman whose face wasn't visible. The caption read, "Good company makes the hard days easier." I stared at the photo, my heart pounding. I couldn't tell for sure if it was Emily, but something about the posture, the hair, the way she leaned into him, it felt unmistakable. Unable to stop myself, I texted one of our mutual friends, Kara. "Have you heard anything about Emily and Alex?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. There was a long pause before her reply. "Jaxon, I didn't want to tell you this, but, yeah. They've been seen together. I'm so sorry." The confirmation hit me like a punch to the gut. All the progress we'd made in counseling, all the promises she'd made to change, it had all been a lie. That night, I sat in the darkened living room, replaying everything in my head. I thought about the years we'd spent together, the moments that had once felt so real and unshakable. And now, it was all gone, reduced to ashes by her choices. For the first time, I allowed myself to fully feel the anger I'd been suppressing. I wasn't just hurt, I was furious. Furious at Emily for what she'd done, furious at myself for believing her lies, and furious at the world for letting this happen to me. As the hours passed, my anger turned into resolve. I wasn't going to let her actions define me anymore. I was done trying to fix something that was beyond repair. By the time the sun rose, I had made up my mind. It was time to take the next step, to start the process of cutting Emily out of my life for good. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew one thing: I couldn't let her betrayal consume me any longer. Filing for divorce was one of the hardest decisions I'd ever made, but it was also the most necessary. The betrayal, the lies, the second chance wasted, it had all left me with no other choice. I contacted an attorney and began the process, each step feeling like another nail in the coffin of the life Emily and I had built together. When I told her about my decision, she didn't seem surprised. "I guess this was inevitable," she said quietly, her voice devoid of the emotion I had expected. "You guess?" I snapped, the anger bubbling to the surface again. "You cheated, Emily. Twice. Did you really think there was anything left to save after that?" She looked at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place, guilt, perhaps, or maybe just resignation. "I'm sorry, Jaxon. For everything. I never wanted it to end this way." But it had, and her apologies felt meaningless now. Word of the divorce spread quickly through our social circle. Most of our friends sided with me, offering their support and expressing disbelief at what Emily had done. "I can't believe she'd do something like that," one friend said. "You deserve so much better." But not everyone saw it that way. A few mutual acquaintances seemed to sympathize with Emily, buying into the narrative that she had been unhappy and pushed into her actions. Hearing that made my blood boil. How could anyone excuse what she had done? At work, I leaned heavily on my colleagues, throwing myself into projects and staying late to avoid the emptiness of my home. My boss, a no-nonsense woman named Karen, pulled me aside one day. "You've been a rock through all this, Jaxon," she said. "But don't forget to take care of yourself, too." I nodded, appreciating her words even as I struggled to apply them. Taking care of myself felt impossible when every day was a reminder of what I'd lost. Emily, meanwhile, wasn't faring much better. The fallout from her actions began to catch up with her. Friends who had initially supported her started to distance themselves as the full story came to light. Professionally, her reputation took a hit when word of her affair with Alex, a business associate, began circulating among her colleagues. One evening, Kara called me. "Did you hear about Emily?" she asked, her tone hesitant. "No," I replied, bracing myself. "What now?" "She lost one of her big accounts." Apparently, the client wasn't thrilled about her personal life bleeding into her work. I didn't feel satisfaction at the news, just a hollow sense of inevitability. Actions have consequences, and Emily was finally starting to face hers. As the weeks passed, I began to focus on rebuilding my life. I reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I'd abandoned years ago, and even started attending a local fitness class to clear my mind. It wasn't easy, and the loneliness still crept in at times, but for the first time in months, I felt like I was moving forward. Emily, on the other hand, seemed stuck. Mutual friends reported that she was drinking more, her once polished appearance beginning to fray. Alex had disappeared from the picture, and she was left to deal with the fallout of her choices alone. In some ways, I felt sorry for her. But mostly, I felt relief that her chaos was no longer mine to bear. The divorce wasn't finalized yet, but I could see the light at the end of the tunnel. It wasn't the life I had planned, but it was mine to rebuild. And that was something Emily could no longer take from me. As the divorce proceedings moved forward, the bitterness between Emily and me became more pronounced. What started as a relatively civil process quickly devolved into a war of attrition. Emily's lawyer pushed for more than her fair share of the assets, claiming she had contributed equally to the marriage despite her recent actions. It was infuriating. I had supported her during the early years of her career, taken care of most household responsibilities when her job required long hours, and now she wanted to drain me of what little stability I had left. "She's grasping at straws," my attorney, a sharp and pragmatic woman named Denise, assured me. "You have a strong case, Jaxon. Don't let her intimidate you." But it was hard not to feel overwhelmed. Every demand she made felt like another betrayal, a reminder that the person I'd once trusted implicitly had become a stranger. The most contentious issue was the house. Emily wanted it, claiming she needed a stable place to rebuild her life. But I wasn't willing to give it up so easily. That house was more than just a piece of property, it was a symbol of the life we'd built together, the dreams we'd shared before everything fell apart. The court hearings were exhausting, each one dragging up memories I'd rather forget. Emily sat across from me, composed and distant, while her lawyer painted a picture of a woman who had been emotionally neglected and pushed to make poor decisions. I wanted to shout, to defend myself against the narrative they were spinning. But Denise reminded me to stay calm, to let the facts speak for themselves. And the facts were damning. The evidence of her affair with Alex, the texts, the receipts, the nights she'd lied about working late, was irrefutable. Even so, the legal system has a way of muddying the waters, and Emily's lawyer did everything possible to cast doubt on my side of the story. By the time the dust settled, I had managed to keep the house, but the victory felt hollow. The cost of the legal battles, both financially and emotionally, had drained me. Emily, meanwhile, seemed to be unraveling. I heard through mutual friends that she had moved into a small apartment across town, her once glamorous lifestyle now reduced to something far more modest. Her professional reputation had taken another hit when her company quietly reassigned her to a less prominent role. Despite everything, I couldn't bring myself to gloat. Seeing her fall apart didn't erase the pain she'd caused me, it only reinforced how much we had both lost. The finalization of the divorce brought a sense of closure, but not the relief I had hoped for. I signed the papers, handed them to Denise, and walked out of the courthouse feeling numb. It was over. The marriage, the battles, the life we'd shared, it was all gone. But as I sat in my car, staring at the steering wheel, I realized that this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something new. Whether that something was better or worse, I didn't know. All I knew was that I was finally free to find out. After the divorce was finalized, I tried to focus on rebuilding my life. The house felt emptier than ever, but I began making small changes to reclaim it as my own. I painted the walls, rearranged furniture, and got rid of the reminders of the life Emily and I had shared. Tucker, our dog, became my constant companion. His wagging tail and quiet presence were often the only things that got me through the worst days. I found comfort in routine, walking Tucker every morning, going to the gym, and filling my evenings with hobbies I'd neglected for years. But no matter how hard I tried to move on, the scars of what had happened remained. I struggled to trust people, always questioning their intentions and second-guessing their words. Friendships felt strained, as if the betrayal had erected an invisible barrier between me and everyone else. I reconnected with a few old friends, people who had known me long before Emily, but even those relationships felt hollow. Conversations were surface level, lacking the depth and vulnerability I craved but couldn't bring myself to offer. One evening, Kara called me, her tone hesitant. "I just wanted to check in," she said. "You've seemed distant. I laughed bitterly. Distance my new normal. You don't have to carry all this alone, Jaxon, she said. What Emily did was horrible, but it doesn't define you. Her words were kind, but they didn't feel true. As much as I wanted to believe that I could leave the past behind, it followed me everywhere. Every time I walked past a restaurant we'd frequented or heard a song we used to love, the memories came flooding back. Emily, too, was struggling. Mutual friends told me that she had become reclusive, rarely attending social gatherings and avoiding conversations about what had happened. Alex was long gone, and her attempts to rebuild her professional life had stalled. Part of me felt sorry for her. Despite everything, I couldn't erase the years we'd spent together, the moments when we had truly been happy. But I also couldn't forget the lies, the betrayal, and the way she had turned our marriage into something unrecognizable. One day, as I was cleaning out the last of her things from the house, I came across an old photo album. It was filled with pictures from our early years together, smiling faces, shared adventures, and the unmistakable warmth of two people in love. I sat down on the floor, flipping through the pages, my chest tightening with a mix of nostalgia and grief. How had we gone from that to this? For the first time, I allowed myself to cry, not out of anger or frustration, but out of mourning for what we had lost. The life we'd built, the future we'd imagined, it was all gone, and there was no getting it back. By the time I closed the album, I felt lighter somehow. The pain was still there, but so was a faint glimmer of acceptance. Moving on wasn't going to be easy. In fact, I wasn't sure if I'd ever fully recover. But I knew I had to try. The weeks turned into months, and life settled into a rhythm that felt oddly foreign yet inevitable. The house was mine now, a silent witness to all that had happened, and I did my best to reshape it into a space that reflected the person I was becoming. But moving on wasn't the clean break I had hoped it would be. The memories of Emily lingered like shadows in the corners of every room. I'd see her smile in old photos I hadn't yet taken down or hear her laugh in the echoes of my mind during quiet moments. For a while, I thought time would dull the edges of the pain, but instead, it seemed to morph into something heavier, a deep, unrelenting sadness. I wasn't angry anymore, I was tired. Tired of carrying the weight of betrayal, of constantly questioning what could have been different. One day, while running errands, I saw her. Emily was sitting on a bench outside a coffee shop, staring blankly at the street. She looked tired, her once vibrant energy dulled. She didn't notice me, and I didn't approach her. Later, I found out through Kara that Emily was struggling more than anyone realized. Her social circle had all but vanished, her career had stalled, and her attempts to start fresh had largely failed. "She's not in a good place," Kara said softly. "I don't think she ever really dealt with what happened." I nodded, unsure how to feel. Emily's pain didn't bring me any satisfaction, if anything, it added to the weight I was already carrying. Her life had crumbled in the wake of her choices, but mine hadn't exactly flourished, either. I had survived, yes, but I wasn't living. One night, I sat on the back porch with Tucker at my feet, staring at the stars and reflecting on everything that had happened. I thought about the early years of our marriage, the love and laughter we had shared before it all went wrong. I thought about the betrayal, the lies, and the fights that had consumed us. And I thought about the person I had become. I didn't recognize him. Emily's betrayal had changed me, hardening parts of me that once felt soft and open. I had built walls around myself so high that even I couldn't see over them. Trust felt like a distant concept, and the idea of letting someone new into my life felt impossible. But as I sat there in the quiet, I realized something else: Emily had changed, too. Her choices had destroyed not just our marriage, but also the person she once was. We had both been consumed by the fallout, trapped in a cycle of regret and loss that neither of us could escape. There were no winners here. The next morning, I packed up the photo albums and other remnants of our life together, storing them in the attic where I wouldn't have to see them every day. It wasn't closure, exactly, but it was a step toward reclaiming my space, my life, and maybe, just maybe, myself. As I closed the attic door, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time: resolve. I wasn't okay. Neither was Emily. But somehow, we both had to find a way to live with the choices we'd made and the scars they'd left behind. And maybe, one day, we'd both find peace. But for now, the wounds were still too raw, the pain too fresh. And that was okay. Healing would come in its own time, if it came at all.